Imagine waking up at the bottom of a dark pit, your hands tied, your throat dry, listening to the sound of your own brothers counting coins above your head. They just sold you, not to a stranger. Your brothers. The same people who ate at the same table as you, who grew up beside you, who knew your name since the day you were born. And they looked you in the eye, heard you begging, and walked away richer. That was Joseph's life at 17 years old. Most people in that situation would break. Most people would give up, turn bitter, or spend the rest of their lives consumed by hatred and the desire for revenge. And honestly, you wouldn't blame them. You would understand it completely. But Joseph did something almost nobody does. He kept going. Not just survived, not just endured. He went on to become the second most powerful man on the face of the earth at the time. He went from the bottom of a pit to the right hand of Pharaoh himself. He went from a teenager in chains to the man who saved an entire civilization from starvation. And the story of how he got there is one of the most remarkable things ever recorded in human history. So sit down, because this is not just an old religious story. This is a masterclass in resilience, patience, strategy, and what happens when a person refuses to let their circumstances define them. This is the story of Joseph. Let's go back to the beginning. Joseph grew up in Canaan, the 11th of 12 sons born to a man named Jacob. And from the very start, Joseph was different. Not different in a bad way, but different in a way that made people uncomfortable. His father Jacob loved him more openly than the other sons. It was obvious, everyone could see it. Jacob even made Joseph a special coat, an ornate robe that set him apart from his brothers. It was beautiful. It was also a declaration, whether Jacob meant it to be or not. It said, "This son is special. This son is different. This son is the one I favor." And his brothers hated him for it. That's important to understand. The hatred came before Joseph did anything wrong. He hadn't stolen from them. He hadn't hurt anyone. He was just loved more openly than they were, and that was enough. Jealousy is a poison that doesn't need a reason. It just needs a target. But Joseph made it worse, not because he was cruel, but because he was young and honest in a way that youth sometimes is, without a filter for the things that shouldn't be said out loud. He had dreams, vivid, symbolic, powerful dreams, and he told his brothers about them. In one dream, they were all in a field binding sheaves of wheat, and suddenly his sheaf stood upright, and all of their sheaves bowed down to it. He told them this. He said it out loud, to their faces. In another dream, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were all bowing down to him. Now a smarter version of Joseph, or maybe just an older version, would have kept that to himself, but he shared it. And his brothers heard the same message in both dreams, that one day Joseph would be above them, that he would rule over them. That was the moment the hatred became something more dangerous. It became a plan. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were tending flocks in the fields. They saw him coming from a distance, and by the time he arrived, they had already decided what to do. They grabbed him, stripped his beautiful coat off his back, threw him into an empty pit, and then they sat down to eat. That detail always stops me. They threw their brother into a hole in the ground, and then sat down to have lunch. That tells you everything about how deep their resentment had gone. It had numbed them to him entirely. The original plan was to kill him, but the oldest brother, Reuben, talked them out of it. He suggested they leave Joseph in the pit instead, secretly planning to come back and rescue him later. But before Reuben could do that, a caravan appeared on the horizon, merchants heading to Egypt with spices and goods. And another brother, Judah, had an idea. Why kill him when we could sell him? 20 pieces of silver. That was the price of Joseph's life. They pulled him out of the pit, handed him to the merchants, and watched the caravan disappear into the distance. Then they took his coat, soaked it in goat's blood, and brought it back to their father. They didn't even have to lie directly. They just showed Jacob the coat and asked if he recognized it. Jacob recognized it immediately. He assumed a wild animal had killed his son, and he wept for Joseph with the kind of grief that does not stop. A father mourning a child he believed was gone forever. Meanwhile, in the back of a caravan somewhere on the road to Egypt, a 17-year-old boy in chains was trying to figure out how to survive what had just happened to him. Egypt was overwhelming. If you've never been far from home, and then suddenly find yourself in the most powerful empire on earth, the scale of it alone is enough to break you. The pyramids, the temples, the markets, the sheer number of people moving through this ancient city with purpose and power. Joseph had none of it. He arrived as cargo. He was purchased by a man named Potiphar, who was one of the highest officers in Pharaoh's court, captain of the guard, a man of enormous power and responsibility, and Joseph became his slave. Now here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Joseph could have sulked. He could have done the bare minimum, dragged his feet, been difficult, let his spirit die in slow motion the way a lot of people do when life has wronged them deeply. No one would have blamed him. Instead, he worked. Not just worked. He threw himself into everything Potiphar gave him to do with everything he had, and something started happening. Potiphar noticed. You can't help but notice someone who works like their life depends on it, while everyone around them is just going through the motions. Joseph stood out. Over time, Potiphar trusted him more and more. Then completely, he made Joseph the overseer of his entire household. Every servant, every resource, every responsibility fell under Joseph's management. Potiphar essentially handed his entire life to this young Hebrew slave and stopped worrying about any of it. Joseph had gone from chains to management, from cargo to trusted steward. In a foreign country, in slavery, he had found a way to rise. But the problem with rising is that it makes you visible, and being visible means people start paying attention to you in ways you didn't ask for. Potiphar had a wife, and she wanted Joseph. She was bold about it too, direct, persistent. Day after day she approached him, and day after day he refused her. He gave her reasons. He told her that Potiphar had trusted him with everything, that betraying that trust would be a sin not just against his master but against God. He held his ground. Most people facing that kind of pressure from someone in power over them would eventually cave. Fear alone is enough to make you compromise. But Joseph said no, again and again, until the day she grabbed his coat and he ran out of the house, leaving the coat behind in her hand. What happened next was calculated and cruel. She called in the household servants, held up the coat, and told them Joseph had tried to assault her. When Potiphar came home, she told him the same story. And Potiphar had Joseph thrown into prison. Joseph had done the right thing. He had been loyal, honest, and principled, and it cost him everything he had spent years building. He went from managing Potiphar's entire household to sitting in a prison cell on a false accusation with no way to defend himself. That's the kind of moment that tests something deep in a person. Not just patience, not just faith. It tests whether you actually believe that doing the right thing matters, even when it clearly doesn't seem to. Prison in ancient Egypt was not a place designed for hope, and yet Joseph did the same thing in prison that he had done in Potiphar's house. He worked, he served, he showed up fully in a place that gave him every reason not to. And again, the same thing happened. The keeper of the prison noticed Joseph and began putting more and more trust in him, until eventually Joseph was overseeing the other prisoners. Even in chains, in a cell, falsely accused and forgotten, Joseph managed to rise. There is a pattern here that is hard to ignore. Every single time Joseph lost everything, the first thing he did was not look for an exit. He looked for a way to be useful, exactly where he was. He gave his best to circumstances that deserved his contempt, and every time, that choice opened something. But the real turning point came from something Joseph could not control at all, something that had nothing to do with his work ethic or his character. It came from a dream. Two men ended up in prison alongside Joseph. Both of them were high-ranking officials in Pharaoh's court. One was the chief cupbearer, the man who tasted Pharaoh's wine and managed his drinking. The other was the chief baker, who managed Pharaoh's food. Both had somehow offended Pharaoh and were being held while the investigation played out. One morning, Joseph noticed they both looked troubled. He asked them why. They each told him they had dreams the night before that disturbed them. They felt like the dreams meant something, but they had no one to interpret them. And Joseph said something that most people in his position would never have had the confidence to say. He said, "Tell me your dreams." The cupbearer went first. He described a vision of a grapevine with 3 branches, blossoming and producing grapes, and he squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and handed it to him. Joseph told him, "The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your position. You will be his cupbearer again." Then Joseph asked him for something in return. He said, "When you are restored, remember me. Tell Pharaoh about me. I was taken from the land of the Hebrews, and I have done nothing to deserve this prison." The baker, encouraged by the positive interpretation, shared his dream next. He had 3 baskets of bread on his head, and in the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but birds kept coming and eating from the basket. Joseph's answer to this one was different. He said, "The 3 baskets are for 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will execute you and hang your body on a pole, and the birds will come and eat your flesh." 3 days later, both interpretations came true exactly as Joseph had said. The cupbearer was restored to his position at Pharaoh's side, the baker was executed, and the cupbearer forgot Joseph completely. He walked out of prison and back into his privileged life, and the man who had given him hope and accuracy, and asked only for a small act of remembrance, simply slipped from his mind. Joseph stayed in prison for 2 more years. 2 more years. After everything, after the pit, after being sold, after being lied about, after doing everything right in Potiphar's house, after serving faithfully in prison, after interpreting those dreams accurately, he sat in that cell for 2 more years, waiting for help that never came. That is the part of the story that most people gloss over, but I think it might be the most important part. Because 2 years of waiting after all that suffering is not a footnote. That is the full weight of what it means to hold on when there is no visible reason to. Then Pharaoh had a dream, and everything changed. Pharaoh dreamed he was standing by the Nile River when 7 fat, healthy cows came out of the water and began grazing in the grass. Then 7 more cows came out of the river, but these were thin, gaunt, ugly, and the 7 thin cows ate the 7 fat cows. Pharaoh woke up, disturbed. He fell back asleep and dreamed again. 7 full, healthy heads of grain growing on a single stalk. Then 7 shriveled, thin heads of grain grew up and swallowed the 7 full ones. In the morning, Pharaoh was shaken. He called in every magician and wise man in Egypt and told them his dreams. Not one of them could interpret them. Not one of them could tell him what they meant. It was at this moment that the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. He went to Pharaoh and told him, "When I was in prison, there was a young Hebrew man there who interpreted my dream and the baker's dream perfectly. Everything he said came true." Pharaoh sent for Joseph immediately. They brought Joseph out of the dungeon, cleaned him up, gave him fresh clothes, and brought him before the most powerful man on earth. Pharaoh looked at him and said, "I have had a dream and no one can interpret it. I've heard that you can." And Joseph said something remarkable. He said, "It is not me. God will give Pharaoh the answer he needs. That is a person who knows exactly who they are. Standing before the ruler of the most powerful empire in the world, in a country that is not his own, coming out of a prison he should not have been in, and his first move is not to perform or impress, it is to be honest about where the ability actually comes from." Pharaoh told him the dreams, and Joseph interpreted them without hesitation. The 7 fat cows and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years of abundance. The 7 thin cows and the 7 shriveled heads of grain are 7 years of famine. Egypt is about to experience 7 years of extraordinary prosperity, followed by 7 years of devastating famine so severe it will consume all the abundance and leave nothing behind. Then Joseph went further. He didn't just interpret, he advised. He told Pharaoh, "Find a wise and discerning man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Appoint commissioners to collect 1/5 of all the harvest during the 7 good years and store it in the cities. That food will be the reserve for the 7 years of famine, so that Egypt will not be destroyed by it." Pharaoh sat back and looked at his officials. He said, "Can we find anyone else like this? A man in whom the Spirit of God is so clearly at work?" And then he turned to Joseph. He said, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning or wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people will submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." He took the signet ring off his own finger and put it on Joseph's hand. He dressed him in robes of fine linen. He placed a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the second chariot, the one directly behind Pharaoh himself, and as they went through the streets, men ran ahead of him calling out, "Make way, make way." Joseph was 30 years old, 13 years after his brothers threw him in a pit, 13 years of slavery, betrayal, false accusation and prison, and in a single conversation, it was all reversed. He went from prisoner to prime minister in the time it took to tell one man's dreams. The 7 years of abundance came, and Joseph was everywhere. He traveled throughout Egypt, setting up the storage system, building granaries in every city, storing grain like sand by the sea, so much that they eventually stopped counting because it was beyond measure. During those years, Joseph also built a life. Pharaoh gave him a wife, a woman named Asenath, and they had 2 sons. Joseph named the first Manasseh, which means causing to forget, because he said God had made him forget all his troubles and all his father's household. He named the second Ephraim, which means fruitful, because God had made him fruitful in the land of his suffering. Those names are not just names, they're a testimony. He was not the same wounded boy anymore. He had processed enough, healed enough, grown enough to be genuinely grateful for where he was and who he had become. Then the 7 years of abundance ended, and the famine began. It did not stay in Egypt, it spread across the entire known world. Every surrounding country felt it. Crops failed, the water dried up, people began to go hungry, and the only place on earth with food was Egypt, because one man had prepared for it. People came from everywhere to buy grain from Egypt, and Joseph was the man who controlled all of it. And then one day 10 men arrived from Canaan. Joseph looked up from his work and recognized them immediately. His brothers, they did not recognize him. The last time they saw him he was 17, a boy in a beautiful coat being dragged away by strangers. Now he was 39 years old, clean-shaven in the Egyptian style, dressed in official robes, sitting on a throne with the authority of Pharaoh behind him. He was the last person they expected to see. They bowed before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph's dream from over 20 years ago had just come true. Take a breath here, because this is the moment. Everything in the story has been built to this. The boy they threw in a pit, the brother they sold for 20 pieces of silver, the one they made their father mourn as dead. He is now the only person standing between them and starvation. He has unlimited power over their lives. He could do anything he wanted. What would you do? What would most people do? Joseph spoke to them harshly. He accused them of being spies. He threw them in jail for 3 days. He was testing them, probing them, watching how they behaved, and he was also, I believe, buying himself time, because he was struggling, not with anger, with something harder to handle than anger. He was struggling with emotion. At one point during this testing, he had to leave the room because he could not hold back the tears. He went to another room and wept, then composed himself and came back. When his brothers spoke among themselves, not knowing he could understand them, they said to each other, "We are being punished for what we did to Joseph. We heard his distress. We saw his anguish when he begged us and we would not listen. That's why this trouble has come upon us." Joseph heard every word. He kept one of his brothers, Simeon, as a kind of insurance, and sent the rest back to Canaan to bring their youngest brother Benjamin. Benjamin was the only other son of Rachel, Joseph's mother, and he had stayed behind with Jacob because Jacob was terrified of losing another son. The brothers returned to their father and told him everything. Jacob's grief was overwhelming. He refused to send Benjamin. He said, "Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." But the famine got worse. Eventually they had no choice. They had to go back to Egypt for more food. And Jacob, with a father's heart breaking in real time, finally agreed to let Benjamin go. When Joseph saw Benjamin walking toward him with his brothers, the emotion hit him like a wave. He pulled himself away again, went to his private room, wept until he could weep no more, then washed his face and came back out. He sat them at a table and had food brought to them. When the food arrived, Benjamin's portion was 5 times larger than everyone else's. He was already showing favoritism to his brother, without them knowing why, and the brothers ate and drank freely with him, still unaware of who he was. But Joseph had one more test. Before his brothers left for home, he had his silver cup hidden in Benjamin's sack. Then he sent them away with their grain. A short while later, he sent his steward after them to accuse them of stealing the cup. The brothers were horrified. They had not stolen it. They opened their sacks, and when the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, they tore their clothes in grief. They were brought back before Joseph, and now the real test was about to begin. Because years ago, these same brothers had thrown one of Jacob's favored sons away, without a second thought. The question was, had they changed? Or were they still capable of abandoning a son of Rachel to save themselves? Judah, the same brother who had originally suggested selling Joseph, stepped forward. He said, "My lord, please let your servant speak a word. Do not be angry with me, even though you are equal to Pharaoh himself. When you asked us if we had a father or a brother, we told you about our father, an old man, and our youngest brother Benjamin, born when our father was old, and his only surviving son from his mother. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left, and his father loves him. You said, 'Bring him here so I can see him.' We told you the boy cannot leave his father. If he leaves, his father will die. But you told us if Benjamin didn't come, we would not see your face again. So we went back and told our father, and when he said we had to return for food, we said we could not go unless our youngest brother was with us. And our father said to us, 'You know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away, and I said he must have been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray hair down to the grave in misery. So now if the boy is not with us when I go back to my father, and if my father sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. Please let your servant remain here as your slave in place of the boy. Let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? Do not let me see the misery that would come on my father." Joseph could not hold himself together anymore. He ordered everyone else out of the room, and then, alone with his brothers, he wept so loudly that the Egyptians in the other parts of the palace could hear it. And through his tears he said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" His brothers could not answer him. They were terrified. He said it again, closer this time. Reaching out to them, he said, "Come close to me." They came close, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. The famine has been in the land for 2 years already, and for 5 more years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance." He was not minimizing what they had done. He was not pretending it had not happened. He was putting it in a frame so enormous that the betrayal, as real and as painful as it was not the whole story. It was part of a story much bigger than any of them had understood. Then he put his arms around his brothers and wept on each of them. He sent them back to Canaan with wagons and food and gifts and a message for his father. Come to Egypt. I will provide for you. Do not delay. When Jacob heard that Joseph was alive, the text says his heart grew numb because he could not believe it. But then as the wagons and gifts and provisions registered around him, as the reality of it sank in, something came back to life in him that had been dead for over 20 years. He said, "My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Jacob packed up everything and everyone, and the whole extended family set out for Egypt. Dozens of people, children, servants, animals, everything. And Joseph got into his chariot and drove out to meet his father. When he saw Jacob, he ran to him. He threw his arms around his father's neck and wept for a long time. And Jacob said, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." The family settled in Egypt in a region called Goshen, and Joseph provided for all of them. He fed them and cared for them through the remaining years of the famine. He introduced his father to Pharaoh. He watched his children grow up around their grandfather. But then Jacob grew old, and as the time of his death approached, he called Joseph to him and made him promise to carry his bones back to Canaan when the time came. Joseph promised, and then Jacob called all of his sons together and blessed each one of them in turn. When he got to Joseph, he blessed him with words full of abundance and promise and the weight of everything he had endured and overcome. Jacob died at 147 years old. Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. They carried his body back to Canaan, as promised, and buried him in the family tomb. And here is where the story reaches its final test.